Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this in memoriam for our dear friend, Brian Lynch, Brian David Lynch. He's quite well known here on YouTube as a result of a video that was posted some time ago, back in 2014, on the GBH Forum Network, The Essential Teachings of Helena, Blavatsky, and Rudolf Steiner, that he did with Robert Allen Pittman. And of course, I'm sure Brian got a laugh out that they spelled his name, his and Robert Allen Pittman's names wrong. But we want to thank Quinn Lynch, his son, for inviting us to do a little sharing of our experience with this remarkable individual who passed away on December 2nd, 2023, and was born on September 26, 1948. And so I'm here with Dr. Douglas Gabriel, and so I'll let Douglas start it off since he actually met Brian first.
Oh, that's dangerous letting me get started. Well, thank you, first off, Quinn, for inviting us. And thank you, Debbie, and all your children. I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with you guys and the family and Brian as all of his 4 children were born, and keep track of him as he went along and left Detroit and went back to Georgia. But, I want to start off with just thanking you and hoping that whatever we say today will help you realize what an incredible, extraordinary person your father was and your husband was. I remember when I first met him, it was very, very strange. I was in Amherst, Massachusetts, going to some college courses there and studying anthroposophy. And I really had studied a lot of anthroposophy up to that point. And I'm driving to Amherst one day and I see a little bookshop down an alley. So I stop and I go in there and I walk in and there's no one there, but I can hear a voice in the back. And I'm thinking, okay, well, nobody's really at the counter or anything. So I'm just going to, wow, look at the books in here. This is amazing. And then I go back and I hear this voice. And I didn't want to interrupt the conversation. It was just one voice speaking to another person. And so I got really close and I started listening. And pretty soon I'm like completely mesmerized, enchanted, captured, and hooked on whoever this is that's speaking, because never in my life had I ever heard anyone with more warmth in their voice, more wisdom in their mind, and more concern and openness to the topic that he was addressing. And then he was in the conversation with this person, and they were talking about the deepest book in all of anthroposophy, Gunther Foxmuth's Etheric Formative Forces. And so I listened and I'm thinking, I thought I was one of the only people who knew this book even existed. And here's Brian explaining the ethers to this person and going on and on. It's, of course, Brian's bookshop there in Amherst, Brian and Debbie's bookshop. And I was just completely captivated and amazed. So I didn't even look at the books. I just listened to the conversation, and it went on forever, as all conversations with Brian did. And then at the end of it, he went up and I think the person had basically didn't have the money to buy some book that they were talking about. And so he gave him the book. The guy walks out. I don't know how Brian made any money in that store. And then I walked up and said, yeah, well, that's all good, well and good. I heard what you said. I was a very snarky young man in those days. I said, but there's a second book, Etheric Formative Forces in Earth Science and Man, or Science and Art, or Religion and Art, or whatever. And he goes, what? I said, yeah, I got a copy of it. It's very rare. And from that moment on, we became fast friends. In those days, we made copies of books. So I made him some copies of books, and we shared the deepest books back and forth. I'd go into the store frequently, and he became my best friend. Matter of fact, I'd been trying to understand anthroposophy and couldn't understand it. And the teachers and the people that I was seeing who were supposed to be top anthroposophists, they couldn't explain it. And Brian would explain these things from a 50,000-foot view, so that it would take days for me reflecting upon what he said to be able to comprehend what he was actually saying. And I think many people probably had that experience with him. So we became very fast friends, and I saw him a lot in those days. Um, and then I decided to go to the Waldorf Institute in Detroit, and I'm in the bookshop. I'm running the bookshop for Werner Glass, who became our teacher. And in walks Brian, and I almost fall over. What are you doing here? I say to him, he goes, well, I'm going to go to school here in the foundation year study, and then take the course in Waldorf education to become a Waldorf teacher. And I'm like, you must be kidding. So am I. I just got here. Well, I didn't. I'd been there for a while, but so, he helped me with the bookstore, and then we became fast friends, and we went through the same courses together in foundational studies and anthroposophic studies with Werner Glass and Hans Gabert, and a plethora of the greatest anthroposophists in the world came to Detroit. And he and I were literally in the same course together for, I don't know, the whole time we were in the anthroposophical studies foundation year, orientation year was called, the Waldorf course, and then we went to Mercy College together. He majored in English, I majored in history, but literally we were in the same classes together for years and years and years. And we always kept very close contact with each other for all the rest of the time that we knew each other while he was still on the earth. And I can just say that he was, of course, John and I were his closest friends here in Detroit, and we were part of a group that we called the Monastic Club, which means if your thoughts aren't on the level of angelic thinking, then you better shut up. There's the group right there. There it is. That's you can see Brian in the back, John right next to him, Bob next to him, and then the guy in the white shirt, that's Howard, the great painter and musician and short story writer. That's Rick Knutson behind him, and that's me in the far left, or my left here. And that was our group, that including also Bobby Hankins, where there he is. There's Bobby Hankins, and including Rick Knutson. And so these group of anthroposophists created a group that might be kind of like the Inklings were. We shared stories together whenever we found wisdom anywhere or anything absolutely amazing. We'd have to run it by each other. So we had this group. Never known anybody to have such a group like this, where we said, okay, if a single one of the four of us, Robert Thibodeau, John, Brian, and myself, if we called a meeting, it was almost like a blood oath. You had to attend. You didn't get a choice, because if one of us had something on our mind that was so important that we needed to share it with each other, we didn't have Google in those days. Matter of fact, Brian was Google. If you wanted to know something, he had, one of the greatest libraries at one time until he and Debbie's house, gigantic 3-story house, burnt down. Even then, later, when he lived in Southfield, he had an astounding library, always cutting edge. And if you needed to know something, you'd ask Brian. If he didn't know it, he'd research it. He was so interested in every person he ever met. If you met Brian Lynch, you never forgot it. And he would spend time with you, just like that person in the bookstore. The first time I heard, that person probably just walked in off the street, and Brian probably spent 2 hours educating him with absolute sincerity. And at the end, gave him the book instead of selling him the book. That was just the way Brian was. So I cannot say, I can go on with a lot of beautiful descriptions of Brian, but I'm not sure who all is at this memorial service. But I want to say to all of you that we should be rejoicing that we knew him.
Yes. And what an introduction. Yes, Brian. Well, I have to step over here for a second and show you something.
Well, this is something like they would do in our club. If something got our bee in our bonnet, that was it. Everything stopped until the bee got dealt with.
This is the last remaining book from the Great Fire that happened to Brian and Debbie back in the day. And Brian gave it to me for a present. He said, here, this is the only book that survived my fire. I said, oh, thanks. I put a blessing on it and hoped it wasn't bringing something with it. But what can you say about Brian? What a delightful human being. And he has uh, his own paths of wisdom that he pursued, as did we all. And so we had this very eclectic mix. One of the earliest of Brian's was he was one of those people you'd see at the airport chanting Hare Krishna. And here's a leading founder, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada, who passed away in January 1st of 1937. And he was one of the most profound cosmologists and experts on ancient Hindu astronomy. But it's funny because Brian gave me a book of his, and they're extremely rare. And he goes through this whole dissertation, this like one of the most advanced cosmological frameworks. And then he gets to the end, and he says, and I'm paraphrasing, but ultimately it's all about love. And then goes into this whole thing about the path of bhakti, which is the path of Krishna and Radha, the path of love and devotion. But I'd like to read a short paragraph by Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami. I stand before you as a teller. I'm going to tell you now a few words more on the Vedanta, and especially its ontological aspect, morphology being a former changeable part of the same. My telling craves a reciprocity of your listening to my sound through your oral reception. Sound is the main substratum of the Vedanta, which deals with a subject unapproachable by our present crippled, imperfect senses. The ear cannot work as a receptacle unless we are willing to admit a sound, and this admittance depends on our taste and previous experience. This prior experience invites affairs within the phenomenal range, but the Vedantic sounds have a different aim. So our reciprocal situation will crown our efforts with success. And it's almost like listening to Brian. He would tell you something and you get this tremendous warm feeling, and then you run into somebody and they say, well, what did he say? And you go, well, I don't know. I could characterize it for you. But he brought you, he was basically would speak across the threshold is the only way I could describe it. And it was such a wonderful experience. And also amongst our group was a project that Douglas and I were involved with, and I was the lab assistant for Ralph Marinelli, who was one of the three directors of the Waldorf teacher training program that was in Southfield, and that wonderful, wonderful building that's actually identical to the center that's in the Assisi. It's a Franciscan center, and it became the Waldorf teacher training program. And there was a paper ultimately written and published, The Heart is Not a Pump, a refutation of the pressure propulsion principle of heart function. And it's interesting because that came out of our little monastic club in a sense, because the heart lectures by Ehrenfurt Pfeiffer, who was the founder of biodynamic gardening and a direct one of the young pupils around Rudolf Steiner. And he said that the success of mankind, basically, without going into chaos, would be to learn to understand that the heart is not a pump and get past that mechanical understanding. And so consequently, I worked with Ralph for a few years, and Douglas was the one who cajoled Ralph into doing it in the first place. And it eventually got published, and now it's become a part of the understanding through mostly through Bronco First, who was also included as one of the authors of the paper. I was the editor, of course, so my name isn't on it because I'm a medical nobody. But after we did all that, I said, and uh, Ralph said to me, "Well, what are you going to do now?" I said, "Well, what I have to do is I have to try and integrate the cosmological features of this understanding, the implications, as Brian would say." And so I wrote this book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail. And it's got 27 cosmological diagrams that are there to help people understand talking to Brian. It's
That's
hilarious.
right.
And so there's all these full page diagrams laying out anthroposophy and the understanding of the archangelic periods and many facets of anthroposophy as laid out in a Kabbalistic template, so to speak, and then was followed by my second volume, The Arcana of Light on the Path, the Star Wisdom of the Tarot, and Light on the Path. And those of you that really know Brian know he was a big fan of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz, who lived in Luxor for 14 years. And this has a forward by our good friend, the late William Bento, the astrosopher. And Brian, you could call Brian an astrosopher. That is the star wisdom. And then ultimately, after that, with Douglas, I'm working on this series on the works of Rudolf Steiner. And so far, we've got 10 of them done. And there are selections of quotations. And these are the kind of things that would be brought to our monastic club. People would bring in a paragraph and we would read it together and then discuss it and then link it up with other lectures from Rudolf Steiner or books or what have you. And knowing that the collected edition of Rudolf Steiner is some 36 and a half feet of shelf space with over 360 some volumes, well, it was quite an undertaking. It went on for many, many, many years. But I've done the service of putting links below so you can get to look at all those. They're all on Amazon. And I'm dedicating all my efforts today to Brian because so much of the content that was shared within those is the fruit of the friendship between the monastic club members. And so I want to thank all of them as a group and Brian in particular, because now he's on the other side helping us out.
I think that's so correct, John. In a way, all that we did together as the monastic club, and which merged with the Romantic Futurists, which was a group that Howard and others, yourself and Robert Thibodeau and others were part of, Les Collins. It was an amazing group of people. And then when the monastic club came along, it was kind of an inner core group of that, of people who wanted to intellectually pursue these kind of things. And so, whether it was radio shows we were doing, cable shows, sharing the podium with him at the Theosophic Society, both here and in Atlanta, or in Hawaii. I brought him out to Hawaii, which was one of the funniest things I think you could ever imagine. I want to show you something, though. Brian had a habit of sending me things all the time, and it'd be a whole envelope, and there'd be like 50 things in it. And this is one thing he sent me, a picture of him when he was a model holding a 10-speed bicycle, no beard, no mustache. He could change it. It depended upon, what facial hair he had on at any particular moment, who his character looked like. This is another one. He used to love to take these Polaroids of everybody, right? And when you weren't really expecting it. But this is one with a handlebar mustache here. And he also loved to mess up every photo anybody else took. So if you were taking a picture of Brian, you had to expect something like this to happen, where on my birthday, he's kissing me to make sure that the shot is funny or peculiar. Here's another one where he is at a birthday party. And if you look very closely, you'll see him down there with his head eating the food off of a platter. He couldn't hardly take a straight shot, a picture that wasn't somehow like, look at this one. This is Howard holding up a picture he did of Brian, right? Now look at the picture. Look at the look on Howard, on Brian's face. Look at Howard like, you really think that looks like me?
Actually, that's that French painter that Brian went to the museum with Debbie in France, Gustave Moreau.
Yes.
And who that particular picture of Gustave Moreau looks just like Brian. But go ahead, continue.
Yes, and so that Brian was looking at him incredulously, going, "Really, Howard?" And Howard is always doing something silly like this one here. Howard would take a picture. He'd grab a picture and hold it in front of you to make a statement. So here's his statement. When Brian's kissing me, John is giving the sign of, that's actually a spiritual sign because it's pointed up. And here's a picture of Howard holding a picture there to make a statement. These guys were always humorous, always intelligent, incredibly profoundly deep. I would say that Brian was the master of the word. Both in English and in English literature, no one can compare to the things that he would bring and read to us, some of which still haunt me to this very day, the flap, flap, flap of batrachian feet behind me. He would read us these stories, and when we'd have these events, eventually the monastic club gathered around it, the anthroposophic study group and the romantic futurists, and we would have 200 people show up to an event. And Brian would be Les would get up and play music. Howard might read a short story or show slides of his art. Robert might stand up and, do his thing. And John was a poet in those days and a musician. He'd play music. We had they'd have a band, but then Brian would come on stage and everyone would fall completely silent and they would be mesmerized. They would be absolutely entranced by what he was saying, because he would string together words like and images that you never thought that your mind could do that, just attempting to follow him. And like John said, you couldn't mimic him. I cannot to this day. I can mimic most anyone, but I can't mimic him. And I can't mimic the way that he delivered his thought because it was so broad. As soon as he started in on a topic, he was so sincere and loving and really wanted you to understand this. But of course, his thought went so far up into the higher realms and so far down that it'd go through the core of the earth all the way to the other side of the earth. And so you thought you were talking to someone 27 feet tall and you were mesmerized and you couldn't say a word. And he'd just go on for hours with a beautiful cadence and warmth and light and wisdom in his speech. We have a phrase in anthroposophy, masters of wisdom and the harmony of feelings and sensations. Well, that's what you could say about Brian. He was a master of wisdom, absolutely, hands down, and not intellectual wisdom, but wisdom that you would carry it with you in your soul after he would say it to you. And then you'd have to go and research, Novalis and the Blue Flower and whatever it was that he had brought to you. It would impact you so much that it'd be hard for you to get over it for a long, long time. So I think anyone who ever met Brian and had a serious conversation with him can't forget him. And if you don't believe that, go and look at that video John posted. This was even after he became ill and had difficulty in speaking, and yet it has 1.7 million hits because people go back and probably see it over and over and over again. They just want to hear him speak. As a matter of fact, while we were in the training program for anthroposophy, he was noted by even our teachers as being so wise that they asked us to do a course. And Brian gave a course on, it was actually 4 of us, on astronomy, astrology, astronomy, it was the first one, John Petering, astrology, Bob Thibodeau, astrosophy, Brian Lynch, and myself, I did cosmology. And it started off, that it was in a small room. And then it got so big that in the school, the place we were going to school, it didn't have a room big enough to hold all the people who would come. And the teachers of the institute got mad at us because, they couldn't get that many people to show up for anything. And then we'd have a study group that we'd have to rent a whole church or a hall so that 200 people could show up so that they could hear us have a conversation. And that's it, the four of us. We'd have a conversation, and we had the ideas. We recorded a lot of them, and we wanted to put them into pamphlets, little things for instruction to help translate anthroposophy for the modern person. And basically the books John just held up, which there are over 40 of them, we have about 20 of them done. All 40 books are written. John is editing them and proofing them. And together, that is the legacy. That is the true legacy that comes out of this work that we did. And we're still carrying it on. And I can tell you that Brian, as I wrote the articles for all of these, I would run them by Brian, and he always gave me feedback. And if he didn't approve of it, then I changed what I had to say. So he's been like a father. He was like a brother. He was like I don't even know words for it. I mean, he was a brother of the third degree, if you know what that means. And also we created a lodge, not only the monastic club, we created a lodge where we tried to bring in the spirit incarnation of what we knew was in anthroposophy, but also everywhere. For instance, John mentioned Hare Krishna. Right down the street from where Debbie and Brian lived when they first came to Detroit was the Hare Krishna Center. I'd go there every Sunday because I'd sing and dance and chant. And when Brian would go, it was just hysterical. He was a real Hare Krishna. He would go into cosmic trance as he's doing these kind of things. And at any one moment, my dear friend, who was an opera singer, Faith Foster, who could quote the most beautiful poetry that was put to music throughout all of history. And so when the two of them would get together, they would start quoting from memory all day long. Brian had so many things memorized in his head. It was absolutely unbelievable. So when he came to Hawaii to visit me, I took him down into the lava tubes. This is a wall and a cage to keep you from going into these tubes. And these are the tubes. And he is now pointing at what we discovered when we were there. I've been in there many times, but when he came, somehow we went a little further than ever. And this is a very, very sacred place to the Hawaiians. But I took Brian to many places in Hawaii, but every time I took him someplace, it became a unique experience for me. For instance, I took him to teach him how to, what you're not supposed to do, ride the whales, right? Ride the turtles and swim with the whales and the dolphins and all these things. But anyway, we're in where are we at? We're in Hanauma Bay on Oahu, because I took him to all the islands when he came to visit. And I told him, Brian, these little tiny painted turtles, they look small. Do not grab them like I showed you how to ride one of the big turtles. The big turtles, they don't get scared, and you can ride them. You hang on behind their neck and you ride them around. So I said, whatever you do not do this here in this bay, okay? Because you see that break wall? Beyond that is a riptide. And if one of these turtles gets you beyond there, I don't think we can save your ass, okay? What did he do? Grabbed the turtle, rode out there, went so far out, I was 100% sure he was going to die. And I had to go out there on a boogie board, and I was pretty sure I wasn't coming back. But eventually, we fought our way back to shore, and he survived. And, after that, he says, yeah, that was great. Oh, great, was it, huh? Or like the time that he made this, he came to Hawaii and he just made the Lynch ring with the escutcheon on it, or whatever, the family crest. He was very proud of this ring. And I'm like, oh, great ring, great ring. So I take him down to the hot pools where the ocean comes in and mixes with the hot water that's heated up by the volcano. And we were down there skinny dipping with some of the beautiful women in Hawaii. And he got kind of lost, and he swam out into the ocean and came back, and the ring was gone. So I offered a $500 reward, and we had people down there for weeks, if not months, looking for this ring of his because he wore it out to the ocean. This is Brian. It's like one day he couldn't make it to class, and he's told, if you're late one more time, you're going to get in trouble. So what did he do? He broke out the window of his Volkswagen Rabbit so he could get it to drive to work. This Brian was in another world. I do believe that he is one of these people who was out of space and time. He lived in a different world, and if you were lucky enough to enter into that world of his, it was an extraordinary event where the harmony of feelings. Remember, he was in the system that John taught me, and we all studied the card system. He's the Jack of Hearts, Jack of Hearts, Jack of Hearts. He's the Christ card. And that's the way he was. He was so giving, he'd forget himself just to give to another person. And just extraordinary. I cannot say enough good things about my friend. And I can tell you, just as John just mentioned, there is no doubt in my mind that he's influenced this legacy that we've created, and that he's a very deep part of that legacy. So I have to thank him for that, because I would have never done many of the things that I've done if it wasn't for his encouragement.
Yes, well, you made me think of something here, and I'm trying to look it up while I'm speaking. But I remember when one time when I was at the Mayflower, managing the Mayflower there with Robert, and we had managed to get a copy of Isaac Newton's book. He did a chronology on biblical studies, and so we managed to come across a first edition of this particular book. And Brian, in about a week, comes back, and he has the book, first edition, leather bound, from the time, from Isaac Newton, geez, the apple on the tree and all that. And he's showing me, and he opens a book, and he's pointing at things. And he had been writing notes in the book in ink. I said, Brian, what are you doing? That's a first edition Isaac Newton. You're putting notes in ink. And he's like, that was Brian. He was like, he was already a dweller across the threshold, and it was like, it just, all this stuff didn't matter to him. It was like when in 1899, the Lesser Kali Yuga ended, that had gone on for 5,000 years, that ended when Krishna left. And so Rudolf Steiner makes the issue about 1899 as being very important, leaving that the Iron Age, Kali Yuga, the age of materialism, and making the transition into the Satya Yuga and on. And so it's very interesting because ultimately Brian's relationship to the whole tradition of that particular stream is very much tied into that impulse. And so Brian was really a harbinger of the end of Kali Yuga for myself and many others, and gave us insights to be able to dwell in the types of ideas that are astronomical and astrological and chronological, and that whole idea of the measure of time and space. And so that is such a important understanding, because it gives you content that you can actually take with you when you cross the threshold. For the abstract, sense-bound type of thinking, you can't take it with you. It doesn't fit in the suitcase. What will fit in the suitcase is kind of the emotive and the imaginative content of the way in which you spoke to the world. And so, in memory of Brian, who had such wonderful content and warmth of feeling, we just wanted to dedicate this little short video. You're muted.
Shall I tell another story?
Yeah, go ahead.
How about the time when the monastic club was formed in this way. Brian and I used to go to the Mayflower bookshop all the time, and Brian would run into John, but I didn't. And then I'd get in debates with Robert Thibodeau, and Robert Thibodeau was a theosophist, and he called me the anthroposophic kid. And it became such spirited debates that he finally said, okay, that's it. I want you to get the smartest anthroposophist you know, and I'll get the smartest guy I know, and we'll get together and we'll hammer this out. And I'm like, okay, all right. Well, I know who I'll get, Brian Lynch. And he didn't really know Brian much at that time. And eventually Robert got John, and we met at Brian's house. And Robert and I walk in together. Oh no, John and Robert walk in together, and Brian and I are standing at the front door. And as soon as they walk in, Robert lights into Brian. I mean, he lights into him with, well, you know that Steiner had black crystals that he planted all over Europe, and you know that he created World War I. And Brian's just sitting there like, oh my God, what is this? What's going on? And then Robert stops for a minute, and then Brian starts in very gently. And basically, Robert was even wilder than I was in those days. And Brian basically, hypnotized Robert into being quiet and listening. And Brian went on for a long time explaining why all those things were theosophical nonsense. And in the end, Robert just says, stop. I speak American. I don't know what language you're speaking, but why don't you speak American? And from that moment on, we were fast friends, and we were basically inseparable for many years. As a matter of fact, when Brian moved away to Atlanta, we would set up readings for him and meetings and all kinds of things, sometimes public events, bring him in. He'd stay at one of our houses, and he'd stay for a while. Because we just missed him so much. We just had to get a little bit of Brian, because without that, it really wasn't the way that it was in the old days. And so we would also use Brian to vet spiritual people. That was one of the things we did. Robert was the center through the Mayflower Bookshop of the spiritual community, the alternative community those days. Anytime anything happened, whether it was Shirley MacLaine's teacher coming in, or whether it was the guy who believed that he thought he knew the Maitreya Buddha, all these people, whoever, because everybody came to Detroit. The monastic club would go, and we'd analyze what the person had to say. We'd go up and talk to them. And so we'd actually vet these people. And eventually, David Spangler became such close friends of ours that one time David Spangler came to Brian's house, and we were there having a meeting. And it was incredible, because after that, they invited us to come up and participate in the what was it called? The Lorien group. That was it called? Yeah.
The Lorien Association.
The Lorien Association. That was David Spangler and Kathy and the Montanoviches and all kinds of people. And so we would go and participate in these things. And it was always a universal experience that after Brian spoke to people, they would just come up and say, who is this guy? Where did you find him? He's the most profound person I've ever heard speak. I just wish I understood half of what he said, and you had to have a fantastic capacity to be able to hold the thoughts that he was expressing, even though he used literature and, Novalis and Rilke and all these great poets and writers to substantiate what he was saying. It was still said in such a way that it was unable, you couldn't forget it. To this very moment, I can still see him sitting on the stage and reading things that he wrote, things that he created, and you couldn't tell sometimes when he'd do these things, whether he wrote them, whether he took it from other people. He would weave this into almost like a multimedia experience, all in your brain, in your intellect. But like I said before, masters of wisdom and the harmony of feelings and sensations. And so Brian had the warmth of heart that Steiner says you must have to warm up your thoughts. And this is what we experienced with him. The warmth, the light, the sound, and the life that came through what he had to say demonstrated that he was truly an initiate, truly someone who was on the path of ascension and was intimately concerned with everyone else finding that path in their own way. And he would do anything that he could to help people. As a matter of fact, one of my things was whatever I'd come across that was really totally cool, or, cool crystals or diamonds or whatever, I would show them to Brian. Matter of fact, then I'd give them to him because I couldn't resist giving them to him. But then the next time I was there, I'd say, hey, where's that crystal I got from Idar Oberstein? And he'd go, oh, I gave it to somebody, as fast as you could give him something, he'd give it away to somebody else, and it was just incredible. In the end, as he was with his children, traveling down to, where was it? To Central America, to other places. He traveled not only with his family, but many other places. You could really see that he had a unique experience of any place that he went. And then you would ask him about it. And even though you might have been there with him, when he describes it, you wonder if you were there because the way he experienced it was so unique compared to the way anybody else would experience it. And his patience with people was made him a saint, and really the Jack of Hearts, that was one of the pillars of the temple in the card system, and it's the card of pure love. And its only fallacy is that it gives selflessly of itself until there's nothing left to give. And this is who I would say Brian was.
This is a gift that Brian gave me on my birthday. He would do that. He would give me these little gifts. And it says, CRC Bird Club at Rest, John, September 27th, 1983. And by CRC Bird, see, in the emblem of the Rosicrucianism, you frequently see a pelican feeding its young from its breast. And so this is the CRC Bird at Rest. CRC is, of course, Christian Rosenkreuz, and Christian Rosenkreuz is one of the two leading masters of wisdom in the harmonization of sensations and feeling in the West. And so you have Christian Rosenkreuz and you have the Master Zarathustra as being primary in the guidance of the development of Western culture, with the interesting contributions of Scythianos, and also, of course, Buddha and numerous other of these master beings. And Brian was an expert in that area of study, and be able to meaningfully bridge the gap between the Eastern School of Theosophy with the masters Moria and Kuthumi, and then be able to take it in a wholesome way and decipher the relationship between Rudolf Steiner's work, which ultimately clarified what was initially brought forward from the books of QT in a very rough form in the stanzas of Dujan and the Secret Doctrine, and in the more Rosicrucian-centered Isis Unveiled. And so the comments that Robert had made were derivative from some of the schism and some of the gossip that was spread around amongst the school in theosophy here with Nidra Brooks and I mean I love Nidra, but she was suffering under the misguided illusion that somehow there was a relationship between Rudolf Steiner and the Jesuits. And yeah, there is, but it has to do with the fact that when Rudolf Steiner gave his From Jesus to Christ lecture cycle, that's when his problems began with the Jesuits. And so to accuse Rudolf Steiner of being a Jesuit is just, it's funny to the first degree. And so where you get with Brian, you're able to reconcile so many things. He and I had spent so much time discussing Johannes Kepler and Tycho de Brahe, the great astronomers. And very much of the study of our circle centered around what happened in the court of Rudolf II, Rudolf Habsburg, and all the interesting individuals that are tied into the Rosicrucian impulse that were around his court at that time. And so you have a very interesting a blending of influences that leads into the later impulse that ultimately fell uh, short of its mission and resulted in the 30 Years' War because of the impulses, the unbridled impulses of materialism. Rudolf Steiner had made the point, and Brian was very much attuned to understanding these principles, but in his uh, Old and New Methods of Initiation is one place where Rudolf Steiner gives some clarification. But starting from the French Revolution was the very beginning, and Rudolf Steiner, it never occurred before in history that people were going to strive to where they could satisfy the thinking, feeling, and will all on the material plane. And nobody before that, of course, thought that you could really truly receive fulfillment in your thinking, feeling, and will in just the material world, that you needed the realms of soul and spirit. And so if you go back to the video that Brian did regarding Madame Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner that I posted a link below, he gives some clarification towards understanding what the implications of that are and how you don't want to end up. And the full quote, by the way, Douglas, is the wet slap of Petrarchian feet. He got that from one of his very many journeys within the realms of literature. But geez, there's so many stories that we could give, but I don't want to make this too long, and so I just want to thank everybody for carrying warmth in your heart for our dear friend Brian David Lynch, and thank you, Douglas, for helping me put this together. And really, God bless you all, and Brian, rest in peace.
I just so wish I could be there, and my very deepest condolences and best wishes to Debbie and to Ian and Quinn and Leaf and Courtney and the whole family there. It's extraordinary that I got to spend some time with you and with Brian, who was such an incredibly significant person who actually burst into my life. As you were talking, John, I realized that the first time I ever met Brian, I was in Spring Valley, staying in this little cabin. And every night around midnight, he and Bradford Riley and another guy, a brilliant anthroposophist, would show up. They'd drive up in a car very quick, kind of probably been drinking, jump out, leave the headlights on, and shine it onto the little cabin that I was in. And then they'd jump out and they'd rehearse a Shakespearean play that they were going to perform at the Spring Valley Auditorium. And so every night around midnight, after I'd worked hard all day in the gardens and stuff, they would jump out and entertain me. And actually, I never spoke a word to him at that. I didn't go out and talk to them. I was just so entertained by them performing. And as you mentioned, Tycho de Brahe, some say in anthroposophy that at this time, Rudolf Steiner indicated that the person who would have all the answers to the rest of anthroposophy would come. And some have suggested that Brian is that person. So again, thank you. I'm sorry we can't be there in person. It would be lovely to see you. But I know one thing, that Brian was extraordinary, and it's proven by his family and his children, as I've followed you on Facebook over the years, have demonstrated that the true spirit that he has instilled in you is going to continue and blossom in so many wonderful ways. I always look forward to seeing what the next thing the Lynches are up to. And again, thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Quinn, for inviting us.
And so in memory of Brian, I'll give this quote from July 22nd, 1919 by Rudolf Steiner. Understanding the real nature of body, soul, and spirit will lead to a human social order based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Thank you so much.